The bond did not break all at once. It was not a sudden merciful execution. It was a slow, agonizing unraveling, a quiet death of the soul that left her gasping for air in the darkest corners of the pack house. Elara traced the fading lines of the crescent moon mark resting heavily on her collarbone. Once it had pulsed with the radiant, intoxicating warmth of golden fire. Once it had been a vibrant, living testament to a love that was meant to outlast the burning stars. Now it was nothing more than a bruised ashen shadow against her pale skin. With every shallow breath she took, another invisible thread tethering her spirit to Alpha Kane snapped. The sound of it echoed only in her mind, a sickening hollow tear that brought a fresh wave of blinding, suffocating agony. She did not scream. She did not cry. She had spent all her tears in the deafening, oppressive silence of the night before, when the final decree was spoken. Instead, she stood before the cracked, tarnished mirror of her new, desolate room in the servants' quarters, watching the physical manifestation of her heartbreak turn from a promise of eternity into a brutal brand of utter humiliation. The pain was a living, breathing entity inside her chest. It clawed viciously at her ribs, it hollowed out her fragile lungs, and it whispered cruel, venomous truths into her ears. "You are not enough. You were never enough." She closed her eyes tightly, letting the freezing, absolute numbness wash over the burning sensation of the fading claim, a fated mate. That was what the ancient moon goddess had promised her when she first locked eyes with Kane beneath the bleeding autumn moon 3 years ago. The intoxicating, overwhelming scent of pine and heavy rain had hijacked her senses, pulling her into a breathless, inescapable orbit around him. She had believed in the sacred, untouchable purity of the mate bond. She had believed that the universe did not make mistakes. But the universe, it seemed, was a cruel, mocking storyteller, and Kane had decided to rewrite their destiny with his own bare hands. He was the Alpha. His word was absolute law, and his law dictated that a fated mate was nothing compared to the lethal, calculating power of a political alliance. The memory of his words played on an endless, torturous loop in her fractured mind. They had stood in his grand, opulent study, the air thick with the suffocating tension of a massive storm about to break. He had not even possessed the basic courage to look her in the eye. He had stared blankly out the sprawling glass window, his broad, muscular shoulders rigid, his jaw clenched in that familiar, devastating line of stubborn resolve. "It is not about love, Elara." He had spoken, his deep voice entirely devoid of the tender, hypnotic warmth that used to melt her very bones. "It is about pure survival. The pack is vulnerable. The northern borders are bleeding heavily. Lyra brings the sheer strength of the obsidian crest. She brings hardened warriors, endless wealth, a ruthless, calculating cunning that we desperately need. You are gentle. You are kind. But kindness cannot slaughter merciless rogues. Kindness cannot protect an ancient bloodline. You are too weak to be my Luna." Weak. The word had dropped into the dead silence between them like a heavy stone, plunging into a bottomless black well. It had shattered the fragile crystalline glass of her heart into a million irreparable pieces. She had not argued. She had not thrown herself at his feet, weeping and begging for the pathetic scraps of his affection. She had not screamed of the sacred, undeniable laws of the moon goddess. When an alpha's dark ambition completely eclipses his soul, no amount of desperate pleading can pierce that blinding darkness. So she had simply swallowed the jagged, lethal blade of his betrayal, bowed her head with a terrifying, hollow grace, and whispered the exact words that had sealed her ultimate doom. "I step aside, Alpha, for the good of the pack." She had offered him the ultimate crushing sacrifice. She had willingly torn her own soul completely in half so he could build his magnificent empire on the bleeding ruins of her devotion. And how had he repaid this catastrophic sacrifice? By banishing her from his side before the morning sun even dared to rise. The brutal descent from the Alpha's cherished adored mate to a forgotten invisible shadow had been merciless and terrifyingly swift. Elara packed her meager personal belongings into a single frayed woven bag. She left behind the luxurious silk sheets, the extravagant flowing gowns, and the shimmering priceless jewels that Kane had once showered upon her. They felt like heavy iron chains now tainted and ruined with the bitter toxic poison of his lies. She walked down the grand sweeping staircase of the pack house, a pale ghost drifting slowly through the halls she had once commanded with soft smiles and gentle healing hands. The venomous whispers had started almost immediately. They slithered rapidly across the polished marble floors, insidious, lethal, and cruel. The pack members, those who had once bowed their heads in deep, unquestioning reverence to her, now quickly averted their eyes, their faces twisted in a sickening, unbearable mixture of pity and blatant contempt. They parted for her, not out of respect, but as if her profound heartbreak were a highly contagious, rotting disease that could destroy their own bonds. Rejected. They murmured softly, the word hissing like a coiled serpent in the opulent gilded corridors. Replaced. Cast aside. Every single syllable was a stinging lash against her exposed, bleeding spirit. She moved steadily into the servants' wing, into a small, suffocating, claustrophobic room where the air was eternally stale and the walls were deeply stained with the relentless, uncaring passage of forgotten time. The freezing, rough stone floor offered absolutely no comfort, only the biting, relentless reality of her new, pathetic existence. Here, in the damp shadows, she was meant to quietly fade away. She was expected to be a silent, obedient, broken spectator to her own devastating replacement. The sheer cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was a slow, deliberate, agonizing torture perfectly designed to break her spirit until there was nothing left but a hollow, compliant, empty shell. But beneath the suffocating, heavy layers of her agonizing grief, beneath the crushing, relentless weight of her public humiliation, something imperceptible was beginning to softly shift. A strange, ancient, and unnerving stillness was settling deeply into her bones. The fresh memory of Lyra's arrival earlier that week burned fiercely behind Elara's eyes. The new Luna had stepped gracefully out of her sleek, black, heavily armored transport like a conquering, merciless queen, her rigid posture dripping with lethal, undeniable arrogance. Lyra was stunning, terrifyingly so, with piercing eyes like sharpened winter ice, and an overwhelming scent of dark musk and crushed metal that completely suffocated the air around her. She had looked at Elara not as a worthy rival, but as an annoying insect. A minor, totally insignificant speck of dust to be casually swept off the grand, bloody chessboard of her towering ambition. When Lyra had placed her perfectly manicured hand flat upon Kane's broad chest, a highly possessive territorial claim, right in front of the entire breathless gathering, Elara had felt the final echoing nail being driven violently into the coffin of her life. Kane had not pulled away. He had actively leaned into the touch, sealing his monumental betrayal before the judging eyes of the watching moon. Now trapped in this dusty, entirely forgotten room, Elara listened to the distant, raucous, booming laughter echoing from the main dining hall. They were openly celebrating her erasure. They were happily drinking to her quiet demise. Let them, she thought, opening her tired eyes to the rapidly encroaching darkness. Let them revel in their stolen, hollow, temporary victory. Outside her narrow, grime-crusted window, the massive preparations for the grand mating ceremony were reaching a fever pitch. The highly anticipated ritual of the Alpha and his new chosen Luna. Lyra, of the Obsidian Crest, the entire surrounding territory was heavily adorned in decadent velvet crimson and shimmering reflective gold. The intoxicating, almost overwhelming scent of imported night-blooming jasmine and rich roasting meats drifted heavily into Elara's bleak sanctuary, an agonizing, constant reminder of the joyous, vibrant celebration happening just beyond her physical reach. Tomorrow night, under the full glowing silver gaze of the ancestral moon, Kane would officially bare his fangs and bite Lyra. He would permanently overwrite the lingering desperate remnants of Elara's fading bond with a new, intensely artificial claim. He would proudly present Lyra to the spirits of the ancestors, and the massive pack would howl in triumphant, deafening, earth-shaking approval. The dark thought sent a violent, agonizing shudder straight down her spine, a sharp phantom pain that ripped ruthlessly through her veins like jagged, shattered glass. She tightly wrapped her thin, trembling arms around her waist, desperately fighting the sudden dizzying wave of absolute, bottomless despair. The broken bond was fighting for its very life inside her, thrashing blindly and violently in its terrible death throes. It pulled painfully at her soul, demanding she run straight to him, demanding she violently fight the arrogant usurper, demanding she brutally reclaim what was rightfully hers by divine decree. But she fiercely anchored her bare feet to the freezing stone floor. She locked her jaw so tightly until she tasted the sharp metallic tang of her own blood blossoming on her tongue. She would not break. She would not give them the supreme satisfaction of watching her crumble into a pathetic, weeping, hysterical mess. As the dying sun began to slowly dip below the jagged black tree line, painting the wide sky in violent, angry shades of bruised purple and bleeding crimson, Elara felt a strange, totally inexplicable sensation ripple gently through her blood. It was incredibly faint. Barely a ghostly whisper against the deafening, roaring tempest of her sorrow. It was a cold, perfectly pure energy, a dormant, utterly forgotten spark hiding in the deepest, most uncharted caverns of her buried lineage. She didn't understand it. She quickly dismissed it as a fleeting hallucination born of sheer, unbearable, mind-numbing exhaustion. She closed her eyes once more, letting the thick, heavy darkness swallow her whole, entirely unaware that the true lethal game had not yet even begun, and that the universe was about to demand a terrifying, apocalyptic balance. The dawn did not simply break. It bled. It bled across the bruised horizon in sickening, violent streaks of ash and copper, a fitting canvas for the day of Elara's ultimate subjugation. She was awakened not by the gentle, intoxicating caress of Kane's fingers as she had been for 3 glorious years, but by the sharp, echoing crack of a wooden cane striking the iron frame of her cot. The head Omega, a bitter, terrifyingly sharp-tongued woman who had once bowed deeply in Elara's presence, now glared down at her with unfiltered, venomous contempt. There was no mercy in her hardened eyes, only the cruel, intoxicating thrill of reversed fortunes. Elara was no longer the cherished, fated mate of the Alpha. She was the lowest rung on the brutal, unforgiving ladder of the pack hierarchy. She was a stain, a living, breathing mistake that needed to be violently scrubbed away before the grand ceremony could commence. They handed her a coarse, heavy woolen tunic that smelled faintly of lye and damp earth, stripping away the final, lingering remnants of her dignity. Her task was a deliberate, calculated torture. She was ordered to polish the massive, sprawling floors of the grand banquet hall. The very hall where in exactly 12 hours Kane would officially sever her soul and permanently bind his spirit to the arrogant, ruthless Lyra. Elara fell to her bruised knees. The biting, freezing marble sent a violent shockwave of pure agony up her fragile spine. She dipped her bare, trembling hands into the bucket of icy, harsh water, the caustic soap burning the delicate, flawless skin that Kane had once kissed with such desperate, consuming reverence. Every rhythmic, sweeping motion of the heavy brush was a physical manifestation of her crushing despair. Scrub. Breathe. Survive. It was a pathetic, hollow mantra, but it was the only thing keeping her fragmented mind from shattering completely into a million irreparable shards. The opulent hall around her was a dizzying, suffocating whirlwind of frenzied, manic preparation. Dozens of pack members rushed past her, their arms burdened with cascading drapes of shimmering crimson silk and massive, heavy golden candelabras. The air was absolutely thick, dense, with the overwhelming cloying scents of roasting venison, spiced winter wine, and the sickeningly sweet perfume of thousands of imported white roses. It was a sensory overload, a suffocating, lethal cocktail designed to drown out the silent, agonizing screams of her dying bond. No one offered her a hand. No one offered her a single fleeting glance of sympathy. They stepped carefully around her huddled, shivering form as if she were a rotting corpse, left entirely to decay in the radiant sunlight. She was utterly, terrifyingly invisible. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere suddenly shifted. The frantic, buzzing chatter of the working pack instantly died, replaced by a dense, terrified silence that sucked the very oxygen from the vast room. Elara did not need to look up to know who had entered. The heavy, oppressive aura rolled over her spine like a freezing, suffocating avalanche. Lyra, the new Luna. She moved with the lethal, predatory grace of a starving apex predator, her sharp, rhythmic footsteps echoing like the deafening strike of an executioner's heavy drum. The scent of dark musk and crushed metal flooded the hall, an aggressive, territorial miasma that violently forced the weaker wolves to immediately bare their throats in blind, pathetic submission. Elara kept her heavy head down, her numb fingers gripping the harsh wooden brush so tightly her knuckles turned a stark, blinding white. She tried desperately to shrink into the freezing shadows to become absolutely nothing. But Lyra was not a creature who allowed anything to exist outside her complete, dominating control. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of her lethal heels stopped abruptly, right beside Elara. For a long, agonizing eternity, there was nothing but the heavy, expectant silence. Then a sharp, exquisitely manicured foot stepped deliberately onto Elara's soaking, bruised hand, pinning it mercilessly against the freezing marble floor. A blinding, searing jolt of sheer agony shot violently up Elara's fragile arm, but she viciously bit down on her bleeding lip, swallowing the desperate scream that clawed frantically at her throat. She would not scream. She would not give this arrogant, venomous interloper the supreme, intoxicating satisfaction of her pain. "Look at this pathetic, wretched thing!" Lyra's voice was a chilling, melodic purr dripping with lethal, toxic malice. It echoed loudly across the silent, breathless hall, ensuring every single pack member witnessed the brutal execution of Elara's pride. "Is this the legendary fated mate, this frail, shivering, broken creature? It is an absolute miracle the pack survived this long under such pathetic, tragic weakness." A sickening, cruel wave of quiet, sycophantic laughter rippled slowly through the gathered crowd. The profound betrayal cut deeper than any physical blade. These were her people. The people she had healed, the people she had deeply loved, the people she had fiercely protected with her gentle spirit. Now they were eagerly feeding her to the wolves for a single scrap of the new Luna's terrifying favor. "Look at me, when your superior speaks to you, Omega." Lyra hissed viciously, applying a sudden bone-crushing pressure to Elara's trapped hand. Elara slowly raised her head. Her eyes, once a vibrant, luminous amber, were now dull, haunted, empty voids. She looked up at the stunning, terrifying woman who had violently stolen her entire universe. Lyra's face was twisted in a mask of absolute, unfiltered disgust. But before Lyra could deliver the final crushing blow, another scent hit the heavy, stagnant air. Pine and heavy rain. Kane. He strode into the grand hall, an imposing, magnificent statue of pure, lethal authority. The entire room instantly dropped to their knees, their foreheads pressing deeply into the polished marble. Elara's heart betrayed her, skipping a violent, desperate beat against her shattered ribs. A tiny, pathetic, dying ember of hope foolishly flared in her chest. Surely he would stop this. Surely seeing his once beloved mate brutally crushed beneath the heel of another would awaken some deeply buried protective instinct. Kane's cold, unreadable eyes swept over the massive, opulent room, finally landing on the brutal, pathetic scene unfolding in the center. He saw Lyra's foot pressing heavily onto Elara's bruised, soaking hand. He saw the agonizing, silent plea completely destroying Elara's exhausted face. He stood absolutely still, his massive chest rising and falling in a slow, calculated rhythm. And then, he casually looked away. "Lyra, my exquisite queen." Kane spoke, his deep, resonant voice perfectly smooth, entirely devoid of any recognizable emotion. "Do not soil your beautiful, flawless hands with the refuse. The ceremony preparations require your brilliant, undeniable vision. Leave the servant to her pathetic labor." The refuse. The servant. The brutal, venomous words did not just break Elara's heart. They completely, permanently incinerated it. The final, microscopic, lingering thread of her fated bond violently snapped. The crescent moon mark on her collarbone flared with a searing, blinding heat for one agonizing, catastrophic second, and then went entirely, permanently dead. The profound emptiness that immediately rushed in to fill the massive, gaping void was terrifying. It was a suffocating, bottomless black hole that threatened to swallow her very soul. Lyra scoffed loudly, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed cruelly in the massive space. She violently kicked her foot out, sending Elara tumbling backward onto the hard, freezing floor, the filthy, icy water splashing heavily over her face and tattered clothes. "Clean up this disgusting mess," Lyra sneered fiercely to the head Omega. "And keep this wretched eyesore completely out of my sight tonight. I will not have my glorious, perfect triumph tainted by the foul, rotting stench of a rejected, broken failure." With a final, triumphant, arrogant toss of her dark hair, Lyra linked her elegant arm through Kane's massive one. Together they turned their backs on the shivering, soaking girl on the floor, walking gracefully away as if she had never even existed. Elara lay perfectly still on the freezing, wet marble. The agonizing physical pain in her crushed hand was absolutely nothing compared to the lethal, apocalyptic devastation destroying her mind. The humiliation was absolute. The subjugation was entirely complete. She closed her eyes tightly, waiting for the suffocating, familiar wave of blinding tears. She waited to completely break. She waited to die of a shattered heart, just as the ancient tragic legends said rejected mates always did. But the tears did not come. The suffocating, blinding hysteria did not arrive. Instead, in the absolute terrifying vacuum left by the violently severed bond, something else began to slowly, inexorably move. It started as a tiny, imperceptible chilling vibration at the very base of her spine. It was a cold, incredibly pure, entirely terrifying energy. It did not feel like the warm, golden, nurturing fire of a typical werewolf spirit. It felt like the freezing, suffocating, crushing depths of the midnight ocean. It felt like an ancient, buried avalanche finally breaking loose from the highest, most dangerous peak of a forgotten mountain. A primordial, rhythmic hum began to vibrate violently beneath her delicate ribs. It was a dark, hidden legacy she had never known she possessed. Her mother, a mysterious, quiet woman who had arrived at the pack completely alone and heavily pregnant, had always strictly warned Elara to hide her true emotions, to constantly blend into the dull, unremarkable background, to never, ever draw unnecessary attention. Elara had always assumed it was because they were weak, pathetic loners. She was wrong. As she lay in the dirty, freezing puddle of water, utterly rejected and entirely broken, her biology fundamentally shifted. The suffocating, toxic weight of her profound grief acted as a massive, lethal pressure cooker, violently cracking open a deeply sealed, heavily guarded vault within her ancient DNA. The scent of vanilla and soft, blooming wildflowers that had always defined her suddenly began to aggressively curdle, to fundamentally change. It morphed slowly, deliberately into something terrifyingly sharp. Something breathtakingly intoxicating. It smelled of ozone right before a massive, lethal lightning strike. It smelled of ancient, undisturbed winter snow and the terrifying metallic tang of pure, unadulterated power. The Pureblood lineage, dormant and heavily suppressed for countless generations, was finally waking up. and it was absolutely, undeniably furious. Elara slowly, deliberately opened her eyes. The dull, haunted, defeated amber was entirely gone. In its place, a terrifying, glowing, icy silver began to softly bleed into her irises. She did not rise. Not yet. She let the pack continue their frantic, manic preparations. She let them blindly celebrate their arrogant, impending doom. Because tonight, the shadows would not just hide her. Tonight, the shadows would actively begin to hunt. The night descended not with the gentle grace of a forgiving lover, but with the suffocating, crushing weight of an executioner's heavy velvet shroud. The ancestral pack house, usually a place of warm, chaotic communion and shared, deeply rooted history, had been entirely transformed. It was now a terrifying, glittering monument to Alpha Kane's ruthless ambition, a staggering, opulent testament to the treacherous, transactional nature of his dark heart. It was the ultimate gilded cage designed flawlessly to trap the dying remnants of Elara's shattered soul and force her to witness her own absolute, irrevocable erasure. Every vast labyrinthine corridor, every towering vaulted ceiling, and every sprawling polished marble surface was heavily draped in the aggressive, suffocating colors of the obsidian crest. Deep, bruised crimsons and blinding metallic golds dominated the visual field, a violent sensory assault that demanded absolute, unquestioning submission from every single creature who dared to step foot inside. Thousands upon thousands of imported blood-red roses had been meticulously woven into massive hanging chandeliers, their heavy, sickeningly sweet perfume actively warring against the primal, intoxicating scents of roasting meats and spiced, intoxicating winter wine. The air itself was impossibly thick, a dense, palpable fog of frenzied anticipation and raw, unchecked predatory excitement that violently clawed at the back of the throat. The primal rhythmic beating of the ceremonial drums began exactly at the stroke of midnight. It was a deep, resonant, terrifying vibration that did not just echo through the grand banquet hall. It actively possessed the very stones of the ancient foundation. It was the undeniable heartbeat of the pack, a synchronized hypnotic cadence that demanded absolute conformity. Thump, thump, thump. The heavy sound slammed repeatedly into Elara's exhausted, fragile chest, forcefully attempting to synchronize her own ragged breathing with the joyous, sickening celebration of her ultimate downfall. She stood absolutely motionless in the deepest, most suffocating shadows of the massive arching pillars bordering the grand hall. She was deliberately draped in the coarse, heavy, humiliating gray wool of the lowest-ranking servant, a stark, pathetic contrast to the shimmering, extravagant silks and priceless, glittering jewels worn by the laughing, careless nobility swirling in the center of the room. She had been explicitly ordered to remain precisely here. She was the discarded, broken trophy positioned meticulously by the venomous new Luna to serve as a silent, agonizing warning to anyone who might ever dare to question the absolute supreme authority of the new regime. Elara was ordered to hold a massive, heavy silver tray of crystal goblets, the biting, freezing metal digging mercilessly into the tender, bruised flesh of her healing hands. But she did not flinch. She did not waver. The terrifying, pure, icy stillness that had violently awakened within her blood earlier that morning now wrapped securely around her fractured mind like an impenetrable, freezing suit of diamond armor. The deafening, raucous chatter of the massive crowd abruptly died. It was a sudden, terrifying vacuum of sound, as if the entire breathing world had violently gasped and entirely forgotten how to exhale. The heavy, towering oak doors at the far end of the opulent hall swung open with a slow, agonizing, dramatic groan that completely shattered the fragile silence. Kane and Lyra entered the cavernous space. They were a terrifying, magnificent vision of pure, unadulterated, lethal power. Kane was dressed in the heavy ceremonial leathers of his ancient ancestors, the dark midnight material intricately heavily embroidered with shimmering metallic threads of pure spun gold. His broad, muscular shoulders looked impossibly wide, his devastatingly handsome face carved from cold, unforgiving, impenetrable marble. He looked like a mythic conquering war god stepped straight out of the bloody, brutal pages of the oldest, most terrifying legends. Beside him, clinging possessively to his massive arm, was Lyra. She was draped in a scandalously sheer, cascading gown of pure, woven crimson silk that clung perfectly to every single flawless curve of her lethal predatory body. A magnificent, terrifying crown of sharpened obsidian spikes rested proudly in her dark, cascading hair, a blatant, arrogant declaration of her newly conquered territory. As they began their slow, deliberate, agonizingly triumphant march down the massive velvet-lined center aisle, the entire pack immediately fell to their knees. It was a synchronized, sweeping wave of absolute blind devotion. The heavy collective thud of hundreds of bodies hitting the polished floor echoed like a terrifying rolling thunderclap. Elara remained standing in her dark, suffocating corner, completely hidden from their arrogant, sweeping gazes, her breath catching painfully in her tightly constricted throat. The overwhelming, suffocating scent of their combined auras hit her like a massive physical blow. It was a sickening, toxic amalgamation of Kane's deep, familiar pine and Lyra's sharp, aggressive, metallic musk. It was a scent that loudly proclaimed a highly artificial, violently forced dominance, completely lacking the warm, intoxicating golden harmony of a true, pure, divinely orchestrated, fated bond. Yet the ignorant, blinded pack inhaled it greedily, entirely mesmerized by the sheer, intoxicating promise of endless wealth and brutal, unmatched military strength. Kane did not look toward the shadows. He did not search the massive, groveling crowd for the gentle, broken girl he had violently discarded. His cold, calculating eyes were locked firmly onto the elevated, heavily gilded altar at the very end of the hall, where the ancient, trembling pack elder waited patiently to formally consecrate the devastating betrayal. Lyra, however, was actively soaking in the absolute adoration like a starving, parasitic creature. Her sharp, piercing, icy eyes violently scanned the kneeling, submissive masses, a cruel, triumphant, highly intoxicating smirk permanently etched onto her flawless, painted lips. She was practically vibrating with the supreme, unmatched thrill of her stolen, unearned victory. Watch, the terrifying, freezing voice whispered softly within the deepest, darkest, most uncharted caverns of Elara's awakening mind. It was not a voice of frantic, weeping despair. It was a voice of pure, terrifying, absolute zero. Watch them blindly worship their own magnificent, impending destruction. Let the lethal, freezing ice fill your empty, shattered veins. You are no longer their fragile, broken martyr. You are the approaching apocalyptic storm. Elara slowly, deliberately inhaled the heavy, sickeningly sweet, suffocating air. The frantic, agonizing pain of the violently severed mate bond, the pain that had brutally tortured her for endless, agonizing days, was suddenly completely, entirely gone. In its place was an unnerving, terrifying, bottomless void, a massive, echoing chasm that was rapidly, aggressively filling with the cold, lethal, crackling energy of her suppressed pureblood lineage. She could acutely feel the heavy, frantic, rapid heartbeats of every single wolf in the massive, suffocating room. She could perfectly hear the microscopic, terrifying friction of their expensive silks, the rushing, frantic flow of their terrified blood, the microscopic, invisible shifts in their shifting primal auras. Her senses were expanding violently, aggressively, pushing far beyond the pathetic normal limits of a standard ordinary omega, stretching out into the dark, terrifying, intoxicating unknown. The arrogant couple finally reached the elevated gilded altar. The ancient frail elder, completely draped in heavy stark white ceremonial robes, slowly raised his trembling wrinkled hands. The deafening rhythmic beating of the massive drums instantly stopped, plunging the entire breathless hall into a dense, terrifying, suffocating silence. The climax of the brutal nightmare was finally terribly here. We gather beneath the heavy judging gaze of the eternal ancestral moon. The elder's voice was remarkably loud, echoing powerfully off the towering vaulted ceilings. To bear witness to the ultimate sacred union of power and destiny, Alpha Kane, protector of the bleeding borders, leader of the fiercely unbroken, steps forward to permanently claim his chosen rightful equal. Elara's icy, silver-tinged eyes locked intensely onto Kane's broad, unmoving back. He was required to speak now. He was required to formally, loudly reject any prior lingering claims to his soul, and permanently, undeniably offer himself entirely to the arrogant woman standing beside him. Kane slowly turned to face the kneeling, breathless crowd. His face was entirely unreadable, an impenetrable, fortified mask of pure, calculated stone. "I, Alpha Kane." His deep, resonant voice rumbled violently through the breathless hall, a terrifying, commanding sound that instantly demanded total, unquestioning submission. "Stand before my loyal, unbroken people and the eternal watching spirits of our mighty ancestors. I completely, permanently sever the fragile, useless ties of the past. I willingly embrace the sheer, unyielding strength of our glorious, undeniably victorious future." He turned back to Lyra. He slowly, deliberately raised his massive, powerful hands and gently framed her stunning, arrogant face. The entire breathless pack leaned forward, collectively, utterly mesmerized, entirely trapped in the heavy, intoxicating gravity of the impending brutal claim. Lyra tilted her elegant, flawless neck to the side, deliberately exposing the delicate, heavily pulsing vein where the Alpha's lethal fangs would violently pierce her flesh, forever marking her as his absolute, unquestionable equal. "I claim you, Lyra of the Obsidian Crest." Kane whispered loudly, the words echoing clearly in the agonizing, suffocating silence. "As my Luna, as my strength, as my permanent, undeniable mate." He slowly, deliberately leaned in. His eyes began to flash with the dangerous, glowing, predatory gold of his dominant inner wolf. His sharp, lethal fangs slowly elongated, gleaming with a terrifying, deadly menace in the heavy, flickering, romantic candlelight. He was mere inches from her exposed, waiting skin. The brutal, final, irreversible betrayal was mere milliseconds away from absolute, permanent completion. Elara watched the terrifying, slow-motion execution of her former life with a terrifying, absolute, unblinking stillness. The silver completely consumed her eyes, now glowing brightly in the dark, suffocating shadows. The temperature in her immediate vicinity plummeted violently, a sudden, lethal, freezing Arctic blast that caused the intricate crystal goblets on her heavy silver tray to suddenly sharply crack with a loud protesting ping. But before Kane's lethal fangs could even graze Lyra's triumphant, waiting flesh, the heavy, oppressive, sickeningly sweet atmosphere of the massive banquet hall violently, fundamentally shattered. It did not happen slowly. It happened with the sudden, apocalyptic, catastrophic force of a massive, undeniably lethal bomb detonating directly inside the enclosed, trapped space. The entire pack house violently shuddered, a deep, terrifying structural groan that instantly drowned out every single frantic gasp in the massive room. The thousands of flickering golden candles instantly, completely extinguished in a single, terrifying, synchronized breath. The gilded cage had just been violently ripped entirely open, and the true, terrifying apex predator had finally, undeniably arrived. The darkness did not merely fall. It slammed into the grand banquet hall with the cataclysmic, bone-shattering force of a collapsing mountain. One moment, the opulent room was a blinding, dizzying spectacle of shimmering gold and triumphant, suffocating crimson. The next, it was a terrifying abyssal void. The sudden violent absence of light was not simply an empty space, but a living, breathing, predatory entity that instantly swallowed the arrogant, joyous cheers and the heavy, rhythmic pounding of the ceremonial drums. A collective, terrified gasp rippled violently through the massive, packed crowd, a pathetic, fragile sound that was immediately crushed by a sudden, unimaginable drop in atmospheric pressure. The very oxygen grew impossibly thick, turning from a heavily perfumed, intoxicating fog into a dense, freezing liquid that burned the terrified lungs and entirely paralyzed the vocal cords. The sickeningly sweet scent of imported white roses and spiced winter wine was violently, completely obliterated. It was instantly replaced by a terrifying primordial aroma. It smelled of ancient, undisturbed glaciers, cracked ozone from a lethal lightning strike, and the sharp coppery tang of freshly spilled blood. It was the scent of absolute, unquestionable, world-ending ruin. At the far end of the cavernous hall, the towering, heavily reinforced oak doors did not simply open. They exploded. The massive iron-wrought hinges, forged meticulously to withstand the brutal, relentless siege of 1,000 rogue wolves, violently shrieked and shattered into a million jagged pieces of twisted metal and splintered wood. The deafening explosive crack echoed through the pitch-black room like a lethal thunderbolt, sending a massive shockwave of pure, unadulterated kinetic force tearing violently down the center aisle. The brutal gust of freezing wind that followed ripped the heavy velvet tapestries directly from the ancient stone walls and sent the shattered, expensive crystal goblets violently skittering across the polished marble floor. And then he stepped across the ruined threshold. He did not need to speak. He did not need to roar or bare his lethal fangs to demand absolute submission. His mere physical existence was a terrifying apocalyptic event. The aura that bled heavily from his towering frame was not the standard recognizable dominance of an ordinary alpha. It was a suffocating, lethal, gravity-crushing weight that instantly, violently brought every single wolf in the grand hall directly to their knees. It was an involuntary, inescapable biological subjugation. Bones cracked loudly, painfully against the freezing marble as hundreds of proud, unbroken warriors were forced face down into the dirt by an invisible, crushing phantom hand. Whimpers of pure, primal terror erupted uncontrollably from the throats of the most hardened, vicious fighters. This was not a leader demanding basic respect. This was a dark, unforgiving god demanding absolute, unquestioning worship. He was the sovereign, the Alpha King, a mythic, terrifying phantom of a ruler who had not left the treacherous frozen peaks of the legendary Northern Citadel in over a century. Yet here he was, a walking, breathing nightmare of pure, lethal sovereignty, completely destroying their fragile reality. As the pale, ghostly light of the ancestral moon violently pierced through the massive, shattered doorway, it illuminated the terrifying, magnificent majesty of the sovereign. He was a colossus of lethal, predatory grace. He wore no opulent, foolish silks, no arrogant, shimmering gold crowns. He was clad entirely in the darkest, most terrifying midnight leather, a material that seemed to actively, hungrily absorb the surrounding shadows. His broad, towering shoulders seemingly blocked out the moon itself. His face was a flawless, terrifying masterpiece, carved from the most unforgiving glacial ice. Sharp, aristocratic cheekbones, a strong, unyielding jaw, and eyes that burned with a terrifying, luminescent, lethal crimson. They were the eyes of an ancient creature that had coldly witnessed the violent birth and the brutal, agonizing death of 1,000 mighty empires. They were eyes that held absolutely zero capacity for human mercy. Every slow, deliberate, rhythmic step he took into the ruined hall sounded like the lethal final strike of an executioner's heavy iron gavel. Crack, crack, crack. The terrifying sound vibrated violently through the ancient stone floor, vibrating directly into the terrified, frantically beating hearts of the completely subjugated pack. On the elevated, heavily gilded altar, the arrogant, triumphant tableau of Kane and Elara had been violently, completely shattered. Kane, the mighty, unbreakable Alpha who had so casually and cruelly discarded his destined fated mate for a pathetic taste of political supremacy, was now violently trembling. The heavy golden dominance that had once radiated so fiercely from his broad muscular chest was instantly permanently extinguished, snuffed out like a pathetic dying candle in a catastrophic hurricane. He fought desperately, pathetically against the crushing, suffocating weight of the king's terrifying aura, his massive muscles visibly straining his teeth, gritted in a pathetic, agonizing display of utterly futile resistance. But the sovereign's ancient power was absolute. With a sickening, resounding crack, Kane's heavy knees buckled violently, slamming heavily onto the polished stone of the altar. He was physically forced to bow his proud, arrogant head, pressing deeply into the very spot where he had just stood as a conquering, undisputed king. Beside him, the arrogant, vicious Elara was a wretched, pathetic, shivering mess. The terrifying, triumphant smirk had been completely, violently erased from her heavily painted, trembling lips. The crushing, aggressive metallic musk she had so proudly, arrogantly flaunted was now entirely tainted with the sour, sickening stench of raw, unadulterated, primal fear. Her perfectly manicured hands clawed desperately at her own throat, gasping violently, terribly for the basic air that the king's heavy, suffocating aura simply refused to grant her. Her sheer, scandalous crimson gown, meant to dazzle, seduce, and dominate, now looked like a tragic, bloody, discarded rag, clinging hopelessly to a terrified, cornered prey animal, completely trapped in a slaughterhouse. In the deepest, most suffocating shadows of the ruined banquet hall, Elara stood perfectly, miraculously still. The cataclysmic, crushing wave of the sovereign's lethal aura that had violently flattened the entire massive pack had completely bypassed her. Or rather, it had not bypassed her. It had deeply, instantly recognized her. As the terrifying, freezing pressure slammed into her fragile, trembling body, the dormant, icy silver energy that had been violently awakening in her own blood suddenly surged forcefully forward to meet it. It was a terrifying, perfect, beautiful collision of absolute zero. The heavy, terrifying cold radiating from the towering king did not crush her delicate bones. It warmly, intimately, intensely embraced her. It resonated perfectly with the terrifying, rhythmic hum vibrating deep within her fragile ribs. The sickening, suffocating fear that completely paralyzed the room did not touch her fractured, healing mind. Instead, a profound, terrifyingly calm, absolute clarity washed cleanly over her. The terrifying, glowing silver completely bleeding into her amber eyes grew impossibly, blindingly bright, cutting fiercely through the dense, oppressive darkness like twin, lethal, guiding stars. She watched the mythic, terrifying sovereign stalk slowly down the ruined center aisle, and for the first time in her agonizing, tragic, pathetic life, she did not feel the desperate, frantic urge to hide. She felt an ancient, undeniable, terrifying magnetic pull. The deeply buried, suppressed pureblood legacy within her instantly recognized its own terrifying, lethal kind. The sovereign did not spare a single fleeting glance at the hundreds of terrified, groveling, weeping wolves lining his path. They were absolutely nothing to him. Less than nothing. Pathetic, completely insignificant insects trembling violently in the massive, consuming shadow of a true, undisputed apex predator. His heavy, rhythmic, lethal boots crunched loudly against the shattered glass and crushed bloody white roses, utterly destroying the opulent, sickeningly sweet decorations with every deliberate, heavy step. He finally reached the base of the elevated gilded altar. He stopped entirely. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, completely maddening, and absolute. It was the terrifying, breathless, agonizing silence of a massive, lethal predator deciding exactly how and when to strike a fatal blow. Kane remained violently pinned to the polished floor, unable to even lift his pathetic eyes to gaze upon the terrifying, flawless face of his supreme, undeniable ruler. The ancient, frail pack elder who just moments ago had loudly proclaimed the glorious false union of power and destiny was completely peacefully unconscious, his weak, fragile heart entirely unable to withstand the catastrophic, suffocating pressure of the king's mere presence. An alpha. The sovereign finally spoke. His voice did not boom. It did not violently echo. It was a low, dark, terrifyingly smooth hypnotic baritone that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and manifest directly inside the terrified, frantically beating hearts of every single person present. It was a voice of pure, liquid shadow vibrating with an ancient, lethal, crushing authority that made the very air violently shudder in terrified response. An alpha is tasked with the sacred absolute protection of the pure divine order. He is tasked with the heavy, undeniable burden of honoring the ancient, unbroken laws forged meticulously by the moon goddess herself. The king slowly, deliberately tilted his majestic, terrifying head, his glowing crimson eyes finally locking onto the pathetic, trembling, broken form of Kane. Yet here in this pathetic, heavily gilded sty of false, arrogant, pathetic kings, I find absolutely nothing but the sickening, rotting stench of ultimate, unforgivable blasphemy. The sovereign slowly, deliberately raised a single, massive, black-gloved hand. A sudden violent shockwave of pure, visible kinetic energy rippled violently outward immediately, violently extinguishing the tiny, pathetic, struggling spark of Kane's inner wolf. The heavy, suffocating silence grew impossibly denser, choking the life from the room. "The ceremony is permanently halted," the king whispered softly. The terrifying, lethal words were barely a breath, yet they possessed the catastrophic, undeniable force of a dying star. "You foolishly claim a false, pathetic Queen Kane of the bleeding borders. You openly, arrogantly defy the sacred divine balance, and for this monumental, unforgivable, catastrophic arrogance, your pathetic, fragile reign ends tonight." Base. As the terrifying absolute decree echoed through the shattered hall, a sudden violent shift occurred in the dense, freezing atmosphere. The sovereign, a terrifying mythic creature entirely focused on the pathetic, groveling alpha before him, suddenly froze entirely. His massive, broad shoulders tensed. The terrifying, glowing crimson of his eyes flickered rapidly, snapping violently away from Kane's trembling form. He slowly, deliberately turned his majestic, terrifying head. He looked entirely past the elevated, heavily gilded altar. He looked completely past the shattered, terrified masses of the broken pack. His lethal, predatory gaze cut violently through the suffocating, heavy darkness, flawlessly tracing the absolute freezing silver energy that was violently blooming in the massive room. He turned completely, his dark, magnificent cloak swirling violently around his towering frame. And then he looked directly into the deepest, most suffocating shadows of the massive, arching pillars. He looked directly, intensely at Elara. The heavy, cataclysmic breath caught violently in Elara's constricted, aching throat. Across the massive, ruined expanse of the grand banquet hall, through the heavy, suffocating fog of pure, primal terror, the absolute, terrifying sovereign of all purebloods locked his immortal eyes with the broken, discarded servant. And the world entirely, permanently stopped spinning. The silence in the ruined banquet hall was no longer merely heavy. It was a physical, vibrating entity, a suffocating, lethal force that pressed ruthlessly against the very fabric of reality. Time itself seemed to fracture and permanently freeze as the terrifying, immortal sovereign of the Northern Citadel locked his burning crimson gaze with the broken, discarded servant in the deepest, darkest shadows. For Elara, The grand, heavily destroyed room simply ceased to exist. The groveling, whimpering pack members, the shattered crystal, the agonizing, lingering scent of Kane's monumental betrayal, all of it dissolved into an absolute, meaningless nothingness. There was only the king. There was only the towering mythic apex predator and the terrifying magnetic gravity pulling violently, inexorably at her awakening soul. When her previous fragile bond with Kane had formed 3 years ago, it had been a soft, golden, comforting warmth. It had been a gentle, flickering candle in the dark. But what slammed into Elara's fragile chest in this catastrophic fraction of a second was not a candle. It was a blinding, apocalyptic supernova. It was a searing, lethal, intoxicating explosion of pure, unadulterated cosmic alignment. A massive, invisible, indestructible chain of pure, crackling energy violently lashed out from the king's towering silhouette, crashing directly through Elara's bruised ribs and violently wrapping itself around her fragile, beating heart. It did not ask for polite permission. It demanded absolute, immediate, unquestioning surrender. She gasped loudly, a sharp, ragged sound that echoed like a gunshot in the breathless hall. The heavy silver tray slipped permanently from her numb, trembling fingers, clattering violently against the freezing marble floor. The sovereign moved. He did not look back at the elevated, heavily gilded altar. He did not spare a single microscopic fraction of his lethal attention for Alpha Kane, who was still violently pressed face down against the cold stone, weeping silent, pathetic tears of absolute primal terror. The king completely ignored the arrogant, vicious Lyra, who was curled into a pathetic, shivering ball of ruined crimson silk, choking on her own toxic metallic musk. They were nothing. They were dust. The sovereign stepped slowly, deliberately off the raised platform, his heavy, dark boots crushing the remains of the arrogant, false ceremony beneath his unforgiving heels. He was walking directly toward the servants' quarters. He was walking directly toward Elara. As he closed the massive distance, the terrifying, lethal Arctic aura that had violently brought the entire pack to their knees began to miraculously, fundamentally change. The crushing atmospheric pressure did not lift from the groveling wolves, it kept them fiercely, violently pinned to the freezing floor, but around Elara the air grew impossibly light. It grew intoxicatingly pure. The terrifying scent of cracked ozone and ancient undisturbed glaciers wrapped gently, intimately around her shivering frame, actively weaving itself through the heavy, humiliating gray wool of her servant's tunic. It was a scent that whispered of eternal, unbreakable protection. It whispered of bloody, devastating wars fought and decisively won entirely in her name. The massive, groveling crowd parted violently before him, desperate to crawl as far away from his lethal, rhythmic footsteps as physically possible. They kept their terrified faces firmly planted against the filthy marble, completely blind to the terrifying, magnificent miracle unfolding directly in their midst. The sovereign finally stopped. He stood merely inches from Elara. Up close, his terrifying, flawless beauty was absolutely paralyzing. His broad, muscular chest, clad in the darkest, most terrifying midnight leather, rose and fell in a heavy, synchronized rhythm with her own frantic, racing heart. He towered over her, a massive, impenetrable fortress of pure, ancient darkness. Yet as he looked down into her glowing, fiercely silver-tinged eyes, the terrifying, lethal crimson of his own gaze miraculously softened. The brutal, unforgiving monster, who had just violently shattered an entire pack with a single whispered decree, suddenly looked at the fragile, bruised girl before him with a look of absolute, breathtaking religious reverence. Slowly, deliberately, the sovereign of all purebloods, the undisputed, terrifying ruler of the mythic Northern Citadel, dropped to one single heavy knee. The heavy, resounding thud of his armored knee striking the stone floor sent a massive, violent shockwave through the breathless hall. It was a sound of ultimate, impossible submission. A collective, muffled whimper of absolute, mind-breaking disbelief rippled violently through the subjugated pack. Kane, violently fighting the crushing pressure pinning his heavy skull to the altar, managed to miraculously turn his head just a fraction of an inch. His bloodshot, terrified eyes widened in pure apocalyptic horror as he witnessed the terrifying godlike king kneeling directly before the pathetic broken Omega he had just cruelly, arrogantly thrown away. The king slowly raised his massive black-gloved hand. He did not reach for her with the aggressive territorial force of an alpha. He reached for her with the gentle, terrifying hesitation of a starving man finally touching a sacred, divine idol. His massive fingers lightly, gently traced the sharp, bruised contour of her pale jawline. The physical contact was a massive, catastrophic electrical strike. A brilliant, blinding, icy blue light flared violently at the exact point of their connection, temporarily illuminating the heavy, suffocating darkness of the ruined hall. Elara's breath hitched painfully. The freezing, pureblood energy that had been violently awakening inside her blood suddenly surged forward, crashing perfectly beautifully into the ancient, lethal power of the king. For 3 long, agonizing centuries, the sovereign whispered softly, his deep, hypnotic baritone trembling with a raw, devastating emotion that violently shook the very foundations of the ancient pack house. I have searched the darkest, most treacherous corners of this wretched, bleeding earth. I have slaughtered thousands in the absolute, desperate silence of my frozen throne. And all this time my magnificent, flawless soul was hiding here, trapped in the pathetic, heavily gilded cage of a foolish, arrogant, blind boy. Niti. He gently, reverently tilted her chin up, forcing her to look completely, entirely into the terrifying depths of his ancient soul. You are not a servant, little wolf. He breathed the words, violently rewriting the very fabric of her tragic reality. You are not a discarded, broken shadow. You are the approaching apocalyptic storm. The king slowly rose to his full, terrifying height, his massive hand firmly, warmly enveloping her fragile, bruised fingers. He turned slowly, deliberately pulling Elara gently out of the deep, suffocating shadows and directly into the pale, ghostly light of the shattered doorway. The entire groveling pack, including the fiercely trembling Alpha Kane and the ruined, pathetic Lyra, were forcibly commanded by the king's crushing aura to turn their terrified heads and bear witness. Look upon your supreme, undeniable destruction. The sovereign's voice boomed violently, a terrifying, earth-shattering roar that completely shattered the remaining intact windows of the grand banquet hall. The sheer kinetic force of his lethal voice physically pressed the pack deeper into the freezing stone. You look upon this radiant, flawless creature, and you blindly see a weak, pathetic Omega. You smell the soft, gentle vanilla of a healer, and you violently mistake it for pathetic, disposable fragility. Your arrogance is only eclipsed by your monumental, catastrophic ignorance. The king firmly, possessively wrapped his massive arm around Elara's delicate waist, pulling her back against his broad, impenetrable chest. She is not merely a wolf of your pathetic, muddy bloodlines, he declared, his voice echoing with absolute lethal certainty. The scent you so casually, cruelly ignored is currently fundamentally shifting. The ancient, terrified vault within her veins has finally, violently burst completely wide open. As if responding directly to his terrifying absolute command, the dormant, suppressed scent that Elara had harbored her entire tragic life violently, permanently mutated. The gentle, soft vanilla and wildflowers completely evaporated, incinerated by the terrifying awakening power of her pure-blood lineage. In its place, a massive, suffocating wave of pure, crackling ozone-freezing midnight snow and sharp, undeniable metallic power flooded the massive, ruined hall. It was a terrifying female mirror of the sovereign's own lethal scent. It slammed violently into the sensitive, terrified noses of the subjugated pack, forcing them to violently gag on their own profound, unforgivable mistake. They were choking on the heavy, undeniable realization of what they had brutally tortured. Kane let out a loud, agonizing primal scream of absolute mind-shattering agony. The realization hit his thick, arrogant skull with the catastrophic force of a massive, speeding freight train. He had not just rejected a loyal kindmate, he had violently, publicly humiliated a dormant pureblood. He had casually thrown away the destined absolute queen of the eternal sovereign. He had personally, actively orchestrated the complete, undeniable slaughter of his own beloved pack. "I am the sovereign of the Northern Citadel." The king's voice dropped back to that terrifying, lethal, hypnotic purr vibrating violently through Elara's spine. "And I hereby formally, permanently claim Elara, not as a Luna of a pathetic, weak, bleeding border pack, but as my eternal, undeniable queen, as the supreme absolute ruler of every single breathing pure blood that walks this cursed, miserable earth." He looked directly at the screaming, writhing Kane, his crimson eyes completely devoid of any recognizable human mercy. You stepped over my magnificent queen to place a pathetic, tarnished brass crown upon a rotting, venomous snake," the sovereign whispered cruelly. "The ancient sacred ceremony was absolutely designed to bond a true alpha to his ultimate power. Instead, it has brilliantly, perfectly orchestrated your absolute, bloody execution." Elara stood tall against the massive, impenetrable wall of the king's chest. The pathetic, heavy gray wool of her servant's tunic felt absolutely meaningless now. The suffocating, blinding pain of her past 3 years of quiet, devoted servitude was completely, permanently erased, washed away by the terrifying, intoxicating, icy fire roaring triumphantly in her veins. She looked down at the violently sobbing, groveling forms of Kane and Lyra. She did not feel a single fleeting drop of pity. The gentle, forgiving Omega they had brutally murdered was entirely, permanently dead. The sovereign's queen had fully, gloriously awakened, and she was absolutely, terrifyingly hungry for blood. The crushing, apocalyptic weight of the sovereign's absolute decree echoed endlessly through the shattered remnants of the grand banquet hall, permanently altering the destiny of every single soul trapped within its ruined walls. The terrifying pureblood king had spoken, and the universe had violently, immediately bent to accommodate his lethal, undeniable truth. The heavy, humiliating gray wool of Elara's servant tunic no longer looked like a tragic, pathetic symbol of ultimate subjugation. Against the massive, impenetrable wall of the king's dark leather chest, draped in the suffocating, freezing Arctic aura of his eternal protection, she looked like a dormant ancient goddess rising violently from the ashes of her own brutal martyrdom. The intoxicating, crackling scent of her violently awakened lineage, pure ozone midnight snow, and sharp metallic power continued to flood the cavernous room, completely incinerating the sickening, sweet remnants of the false ceremony. It was a scent that demanded absolute, unquestioning reverence. It was a scent that loudly, clearly proclaimed the catastrophic, undeniable end of Alpha Kane's pathetic, fragile reign. Beneath them, trapped heavily on the freezing, shattered marble, Kane finally managed to drag his trembling, heavy head upward. The violent, crushing pressure of the king's aura had deliberately, cruelly loosened just a fraction of an inch, allowing the ruined Alpha the pathetic, agonizing ability to breathe, to speak, and to fully comprehend the monumental, cataclysmic scale of his own unforgivable stupidity. Kane's face, once a magnificent, arrogant mask of pure, unyielding stone, was now completely unrecognizable. It was twisted into a grotesque, horrifying portrait of raw, unadulterated, primal agony. Tears of profound, absolute terror streamed heavily down his pale, sweating cheeks, cutting pathetic, gleaming tracks through the thick layer of dust and shattered crystal clinging to his skin. He looked at Elara. He did not look at her with the cold, calculating, dismissive eyes that had so casually thrown her away in his dark, opulent study. He looked at her as a starving, dying man looks at a magnificent, unreachable oasis. He saw the terrifying, glowing silver bleeding intensely into her beautiful amber eyes. He felt the massive, crushing wave of her ancient pure-blood power vibrating violently against his own weak, pathetic inner wolf. The catastrophic realization physically broke him. He had held the ultimate divine key to absolute unmatched supremacy in the very palms of his hands, and he had arrogantly, violently crushed it to make room for a pathetic, worthless piece of tarnished brass. Elara. Kane gasped, his deep voice cracking into a sickening, desperate, wretched sob. He began to violently, pathetically drag his massive, trembling body forward across the ruined floor. The sharp, jagged shards of broken crystal sliced ruthlessly into his hands and knees, leaving a pathetic, smeared trail of dark crimson blood on the polished marble. But he did not stop. He could not stop. The devastating, suicidal instinct to reclaim the magnificent, terrifying creature he had so foolishly discarded completely overrode his basic, primal sense of self-preservation. Elara, please. Please, my sweet, gentle mate. I was blind. I was so utterly, catastrophically blind. The dark ambition, the terrifying threat to the borders. It completely poisoned my mind. It poisoned my soul. He reached out a heavy, bleeding, trembling hand toward the hem of her coarse gray tunic, his eyes begging with a pathetic, sickening desperation that violently turned Elara's stomach. I didn't know. Kane wept, his voice echoing tragically in the breathless, suffocating silence of the hall. I didn't know what you truly were. If you had only told me, if you had only shown me this magnificent, terrifying power, I would have never looked at another. I would have worshipped you. I would have crowned you. The sovereign's massive muscular frame immediately tensed with a sudden lethal, terrifying violence. A deep, bone-rattling snarl began to vibrate violently in the king's massive chest, a sound so terrifyingly primal it caused several of the groveling pack members to instantly, peacefully lose consciousness from sheer terror. The king's hand dropped heavily, lethally to his side, his sharp obsidian claws slowly elongating with a terrifying, deadly menace. He was entirely prepared to violently, permanently separate Kane's arrogant, weeping head from his broad, muscular shoulders for the supreme insult of his pathetic, filthy touch. But Elara gently, deliberately placed her small, fragile hand flat against the king's massive, heavily armored chest. The terrifying absolute zero of her pureblood energy merged flawlessly with his searing, lethal rage, instantly, miraculously soothing the violent, apocalyptic storm brewing within him. The sovereign instantly halted. He looked down at her, his glowing crimson eyes wide with a terrifying, absolute religious devotion. He was the undisputed immortal king of the eternal night, but in this singular, breathtaking moment he was entirely, utterly hers to command. He slowly, deliberately stepped back just a fraction of an inch, granting his newly awakened queen the absolute, unquestionable floor to deliver her own devastating, glorious retribution. Elara stepped forward. She did not walk with the soft, gentle, timid grace of the obedient broken Omega she had been forced to play. She moved with the slow, terrifying, deliberate elegance of a lethal apex predator circling a hopelessly trapped, heavily bleeding prey. She looked down at Kane, observing his pathetic, groveling, bleeding form with a cold, terrifying, absolute detachment. The frantic, agonizing love she had once harbored for this foolish, arrogant boy was entirely, permanently dead, completely incinerated in the blinding, purifying fire of her true, ancient lineage. You would have worshipped me. Elara's voice was a chilling, melodic, terrifying purr. It was no longer soft. It was imbued with the freezing, undeniable, crackling authority of the Northern Citadel. The sound of it sent a violent collective shudder through the entire breathless pack. You would have crowned me Alpha Kane only when my sheer terrifying power proved to be a lucrative, highly profitable asset to your dark, insatiable ambition. She slowly, deliberately tilted her head, her glowing silver eyes piercing completely through his pathetic, shattered soul. That is the absolute terrifying difference between a true immortal king and a pathetic groveling boy playing dress-up in a heavily gilded cage. The sovereign did not kneel before me because I suddenly violently manifested an ancient, undeniable power. He recognized my soul when I was completely stripped of my dignity. He recognized his eternal queen when I was violently buried in the suffocating dirt, drowning in the pathetic, heavy gray wool of your absolute cruelty. He did not ask what I could violently conquer for him. He simply recognized that I was his. Kane violently flinched as if he had been physically brutally struck by a heavy iron weapon. A fresh, massive wave of agonizing, despairing sobs ripped violently from his throat. He looked desperately toward the pathetic, shivering pile of ruined crimson silk a few feet away. Lyra, the terrifying, arrogant, vicious interloper who had so proudly, violently stomped on Elara's soaking, bruised hand just hours before. The new Luna was completely, utterly broken. Her sharp, piercing, icy eyes were wide, with a blank, terrified, mind-shattering madness. The crushing, suffocating weight of the sovereign's presence combined with the absolute, terrifying realization that she had openly, physically tortured his destined queen had completely, permanently fractured her fragile, arrogant mind. She rocked back and forth on the freezing marble aggressively, silently, weeping, completely abandoned by the very Alpha she had so ruthlessly, politically seduced. "Look at your magnificent, unbreakable strength, Kane," Elara whispered cruelly, gesturing dismissively toward the pathetic, ruined woman. "Look at the endless wealth and the ruthless, calculating cunning you so desperately, violently craved. You completely destroyed our sacred fated bond for a pathetic temporary illusion. You traded a pure, divine eternity for a handful of heavily tainted, worthless coins." Elara slowly turned her back on the weeping, completely destroyed Alpha. The motion was absolute. It was final. It was the catastrophic, undeniable slamming of a heavy iron vault door. "You are completely, undeniably right about one thing, Kane," she stated, her voice echoing with a terrifying, absolute finality. "I am stepping aside, not for the pathetic, rotting good of this heavily poisoned, blinded pack. I am stepping aside to take my rightful, magnificent place upon a throne you could not possibly ever begin to comprehend." She walked gracefully back to the towering, magnificent sovereign. He was waiting for her, his massive dark cloak swirling violently in the freezing, unnatural wind rushing through the completely shattered doorway. He gently, possessively wrapped his massive arm around her shoulders, pulling her fiercely against his side. He looked one last, terrifying time at the groveling, destroyed Alpha. "Your pathetic, fragile reign is entirely, permanently over, Kane." The king's hypnotic, lethal voice boomed with the absolute crushing force of a final judgment. "Your heavily guarded borders will violently crumble. Your blinded, arrogant pack will completely fracture. You will live the rest of your miserable, pathetic, extended life absolutely choking on the suffocating, heavy ashes of this monumental, unforgivable mistake. You are utterly, permanently forgotten." With a sudden, violent, deafening crack of displaced air, the terrifying, crushing atmospheric pressure inside the grand banquet hall miraculously lifted. But the arrogant, triumphant pack did not rise. They remained violently pressed to the freezing marble, weeping silently in the heavy, suffocating darkness, completely paralyzed by the terrifying, profound magnitude of what they had just witnessed and the absolute devastating doom they had brought upon themselves. Elara did not look back. She walked slowly, deliberately beside her terrifying, immortal king, stepping gracefully over the heavy, splintered wood and the completely ruined, bloody white roses. They walked out of the massive, shattered entrance of the heavily gilded cage and directly into the cold, pure, illuminating embrace of the ancestral silver moon. The heavily armored, terrifying pureblood guards of the Northern Citadel were waiting silently in the shadows of the ancient trees, their glowing crimson eyes burning fiercely in the dark. As Elara and the Sovereign approached, the massive lethal warriors fell entirely to their knees in absolute unquestioning religious reverence, lowering their heavy metallic heads to officially finally welcome their magnificent long-lost queen. The cold, intoxicating wind whipped fiercely through her dark hair, washing away the final lingering, suffocating stench of Kane's monumental betrayal. Elara inhaled deeply, the freezing ancient power settling perfectly permanently into her veins. She was no longer a discarded broken shadow. She was the eternal terrifying storm, and her glorious devastating reign had only just begun. As the king's massive shadowy carriage disappears into the dense frozen mists of the northern woods, leaving the completely ruined weeping Alpha choking on his own bitter ashes, a heavy hypnotic question lingers in the silent silver moonlight. Tell me, children of the moon, if you stood in Elara's fragile shoes staring down the very Alpha who brutally casually shattered your heart and stripped away your dignity, would you have offered him a single fleeting drop of mercy? Did Kane and his false arrogant Luna get the absolute devastating retribution they so richly, undeniably deserved? Leave your whispers in the comments below and let your voices join the eternal howl. If you felt the terrifying, crackling power of the Pureblood Queen awaken in your own veins tonight, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to Moonfire Tales for more captivating, immersive legends of ultimate betrayal and glorious, unmatched revenge. Until the next full moon rises, stay fierce, stay unbroken, and always, always trust the terrifying power of your own hidden shadows.